And so he will take us away. And you are joining, just as a reminder, the Emergency Medical Services for Children Innovation and Improvement Center. And with that, I'll give you Trevor.
All
Trevor, take it
right.
away.
Great. Howdy, all. Nice to meet you. My name is Trevor Covington. I'm a certified emergency manager out of Washington State. My background is health and human services disaster response. I've been doing that for a little over a decade and a half. Primarily got started with the American Red Cross. I worked quite a bit of wildfires and other disasters. Did some consulting for FEMA Region 10 with a group called TerraCore. Spent a few years at the Department of Health, including leading the COVID-19 response for operations. And then since then, I've been independent, and I'm affiliated with the Pediatric Pandemic Network as the mental and behavioral health domain manager. And that's kind of the capacity I'm here to talk to you all about pediatric a little bit of pediatric emergency management. And so today's objective is really we want you to be able to walk away with one example of how pediatric needs are coordinated and met within emergency management systems and structures. I'm hoping you walk away with quite a bit more than that and quite a few examples. In particular, one of the things for me is giving you a very clear in on how you can start engaging around some of this stuff. So if you don't mind, we're going to go ahead and get moving. I introduced myself very briefly. I like to include this sort of image on most of the presentations I deliver. This is from the Alaskan Valdez earthquake. I joke that disasters are in my blood. My family was in this earthquake, and I'm only alive today because my mom was very naughty that day and got grounded, so she wasn't able to go down to the dock and meet everyone coming in off the boats, and that ended up saving her life. So I'm here because my mom misbehaved one day in 1964. With that in mind, if I could real quick, if folks wouldn't mind like raising their hand or indicating in the chat if you were here during the last webinar. And I'll look for that as I talk, just trying to get a feel of who might have been here last time. But previously, I presented a little bit on the impacts to kids during disasters, kind of what natural disasters do, and had a mental health focus. And that prior presentation really kind of focused on the nature of disasters. This one's going to focus more on emergency management. So how do we respond to disasters? One of the things that we highlighted is kind of the nature of high impact, low frequency events. So things that are really impactful when they happen, they don't happen a lot. And those are really the things that kind of wallop us because we're not used to them. And pediatrics is very much that for a lot of facilities. Certainly a pediatric mass casualty incident is that for a lot of communities and organizations. And so the conversation today is going to build on that. We're going to focus a little bit more on the emergency management, what it is, how it came to be, the core components and structures and organizations, and kind of the state of pediatric preparedness. I'm going to weave in some commentary to that as we go through. Please feel free to ask questions as we go. I've got the chat pulled up, and certainly I'll take an eye at that. Don't hesitate to unmute and raise a question as well. This can be more of a discussion if we want, but if not, and if you just want to sit back and listen, I'm glad to present as we go through. And then certainly, as the team noted, please add your organization in chat. I'm going to reference that a little bit back as we move on. So. Pediatric emergency management. Let's look at emergency management in general, where it started, and then we'll weave in some of the pediatric components on the next slide. One of the things I like to emphasize is emergency management's been around as long as we've had disasters, right? Disasters happen, bad things occur, and people respond to them. Very much that was kind of ad hoc, organic, and local response, right? We might have not called it sheltering and evacuation, but we responded to disasters as they came in, and people provided assistance. And really, that's kind of the story of emergency management, is this reactionary development. While we like to pretend we're a profession that looks forward and kind of prepares for the next thing coming, very much a lot of the profession is based on what has already happened, the prior disaster, right? And so you see emergency management come out of that world, specifically civil defense. So in the early world wars, we saw a lot of civil defense reaction to bombing, starting with World War I and building World War II. Roosevelt forms the Office of Civilian Defense, and this is kind of the start of formal emergency management in the United States and a lot of emergency management broadly in different countries. So you see civilian engagement of things of drills, blackouts, sandbagging operations. And then during the Cold War, with an increased chance of attack on American soil, we see that expanded through Kennedy with more focus on fallout shelters and stockpiles. And in a lot of ways, these are kind of like the initial into sheltering operations within the United States. And as these different events occur, we have this reactionary development within our government. One of the big ones that started emergency management and kind of moved it from the civil defense space into its own field was the 3 Mile Island incident, where there is a partial reactor meltdown. It's almost one of those like classic case studies in my profession around an uncoordinated, poor plan, how not to get ready for disasters, how not to respond to them, how not to communicate about them, right? We did a lot of things wrong in that. And that's where we saw President Carter conduct a study, and that later informed the formation of FEMA to coordinate the various disaster functions that were spread out across the federal government. After that, we had, certainly other disasters. We had September 11th, um, certainly a big event. We had a lot of major lessons learned from it, in particular on the tactical side of things. So like the on the ground, how do police work with other police, how they work with fire, how do they work with the EMS. A lot of challenges around communication, joint response, unity of efforts. So this idea that we're working towards common goals. And that's where we see Department of Homeland Security formed and oversees FEMA. You see a lot more of the counterterrorism functions get integrated into emergency management, which is both good and bad. There's some trade-offs to that. And then we kind of move into this next big one, right? So whatever is happening, whether it's Katrina, we saw a lot of lessons learned there around evacuation, mass sheltering, tons of things around pets as well. So essentially, you kind of see this big disaster hit, and then a whole package of reforms and laws come out around emergency management. So that nice little acronym, PCIMRA, Post-Katrina Emergency Management Reform Act, changed a bunch of things emergency management does. Same thing with Hurricane Sandy. And you kind of see this thing where we have a disaster hit, we get walloped, we see a bunch of things we didn't do well, and then we change the profession. So in that sense, while we'd like to think we're, future looking and kind of, thinking about what's going to be coming our way, instead, we're kind of looking backwards very often in emergency management and preparing for the disaster that already occurred. It's one of the challenges that we kind of face in an ever-evolving world. So within that broad background of emergency management, we have laws and programs for children. Now, this isn't a comprehensive list. I just want to give you a gist of how some of this fits in. So you have one of the House resolutions there, the State and High Risk Urban Area Working Act. This came out in December 2016, and then established some of the requirements of these planning committees. A lot of them focused around counterterrorism to include the membership of schools within those planning committees. So you'll start to see this in various grants and elements that came out of requiring to work with different children's groups or groups that represent underserved kids. We have the Homeland Security Act for Children, much more focused. Gave the charge to DHS to integrate children into their policies and programs, making sure they're accounting for the needs of kids, and also directed FEMA to prepare for the needs of children. Out of this comes an annual report on the topic. Now, just because Congress mandates it doesn't mean it magically occurs. There's still a lot of work being done around that, but there's a specific act around it. And then some folks on this call might be familiar with the hospital preparedness program. I'll talk a little bit more, but these are really kind of the emergency management, healthcare preparedness synergy, right? Where we see organizations, healthcare coalitions just focused exclusively on these topics. And the hospital preparedness program requires a joint letter of support from EMSC, so Emergency Medical Services for Children, and the HPP awardees. It has specific pediatric components, and based on the year, there's some specific requirements around pediatrics, and that just changes. So after each major disaster and event, we see some of this. Some of these have been kind of integrated over time. And then on a local level, almost all the requirements around emergency management come from these federal mandates or federal laws, although some cities and states have specific initiatives around it as well. So what is emergency management? That might be helpful, right? I've thrown out this phrase a few different times. What you have here are some of the mission descriptions of the different emergency management agencies in a few countries across the world. So we have FEMA, Public Safety Canada, and then the National Emergency Management Agency out of Australia. And while I won't read through these, I just want to highlight a few different words. So out of the first one, we see this language around preparing for, protecting against, responding to, and recovering from hazards. From Public Safety Canada, we see things like protect themselves. We see the word leadership and policies, plans, and range and programs. And out of Australia, we see phrases like secure and strong, resilient, before, during, after. So one of the things I'd highlight is you kind of hear this thing of a cycle. So things we do through the cycle of disaster. What do we do before the disaster? What do we do during it? What do we do after? And then some of the flavors of what emergency management does. How do we help communities protect themselves? How do we lead across agencies? How do we institute a range of policies, plans, and programs? And how do we make our communities more secure and resilient? And in a lot of senses, that's the focus of emergency management. For some Forrest Gump fans, I threw in this title there. So emergency management is, as emergency management does. What is emergency management really about? It's about reducing loss from disasters, right? There's kind of two key parts of this. How do we lower vulnerability and fragility and increase resilience? So when disasters hit us, how do they, impact us less? There's a whole bunch of different ways you can look at this, everything from making sure we have levees to deal with storm surge to making sure we have the right IT security protocols. So, our whole system doesn't go down and we get hacked. So how do we reduce the impact from the disaster when it hits us? And then the second bullet point is around how do we actually respond to the disaster and have the capacity, capability, and the readiness to do so? There's a lot of functions with the teams, organizations, and systems. One thing I like to highlight and kind of a pre-takeaway from this call, you all are probably part of emergency management in one way or another. If you're part of any organization of any size, private or public, somewhere in your broad structure, there's probably someone doing an emergency management job that's worthwhile to connect to and figure out how you can provide support to. Certainly within large healthcare systems, there's specific roles in this. There's roles in this in local government. And even if it's not explicitly emergency management, a lot of this is often kind of lumped in with emergency response and business continuity, are similar phrases, and I'll get to that in a second. So these individuals, within teams, organizations, and systems, they work to understand risks. So what's our vulnerability? What's our vulnerability specific hazards? What's hazards are in the area, and sharing that awareness. They help establish a mission, scope, objectives, and strategies to respond to disasters. So when a disaster hits, what are we going to do? What do we need to do differently? How are we going to achieve that? And then they develop plans, they build training exercise programs, develop the capacity to conduct those operations. We educate and advocate with leaders and policymakers. And one of the big things we do is leverage experts, right? So people aren't often experts in disasters. For a lot of folks, there's something that happened to people once or twice in their lifetime, if even that. So a role of an emergency manager is very often taking in someone that's an expert in something, say pediatrics, like pediatric mental health, and figuring out how they can leverage that expertise within the context of a specific event or a disaster. Very often, my role at public health was working with like a smoke epidemiologist or someone specialized in radiation hazards, what have you, and translating their knowledge into broad public knowledge, and then our actual operations as public health to respond to the incident. And emergency management is also kind of a body of knowledge. It has a bunch of principles, concepts, and practices. It pulls from a whole bunch of different places. Some of the big pieces that come up are complexity, so systems theory, risk, uncertainty, decision-making, leadership, management, data science, and epistemology. It's essentially a Venn diagram of a bunch of cool things. I like to joke emergency management is one of the last true generalists. We get to learn a bunch of different things and work with a bunch of different folks. Then there's also hazard-specific knowledge as well, epidemiology, hydrology, counterterrorism, psychology, and then we tend to work within specific industries. So example, healthcare, public health, business continuity, mass care, which is the bulk sheltering, feeding, and assistance of individuals. So within that in mind, you'll find emergency management in all different levels and systems. Looking at pediatrics alone, just thinking about that, we have healthcare, we have mental health, we have the educational systems, the social support systems, the families, communities, all those sorts of pieces. And pediatrics is an element of all those, right? And we have pediatric needs during the disaster, and the coordination of those gets really tricky. So we'll show a little bit of a matrix at an end to explore this a little bit, but I really want to note pediatric specific considerations are really underdeveloped. There's very few programs or teams that have kind of robust pediatric considerations in their plans. Very few have actually trained and exercised those. And, ideally, when people run an exercise and simulate things, they kind of integrate the whole spectrum, actual folks from their community, but very often you kind of get one group of individuals, and so a lot of times children aren't even integrated into disaster scenarios. So you see things like decontamination scenarios where there's no like actual practicing with kids and what that look like. We're getting better at it, but just like I kind of showed you in previous slides, it's a reactionary development as a profession. So I threw out a few phrases. I just want to kind of orient a little bit. So we have emergency management, which I've been talking about. Then you have emergency preparedness and business continuity, or excuse me, emergency response. Emergency response is like the routine disaster or emergencies. And it feels weird to some people to say routine and emergencies, although I think a lot of folks on this call might be familiar with that. But these are the things that happen in our community every day that we're like pretty good at dealing with. We have a little house fire, we have like a car accident. Those are things we can respond to routinely. And that's kind of emergency response. Business continuity are all the things we do to continue our business during a disaster. If you're familiar with the phrase right there, business continuity, it describes itself. So these are the actions we take to provide our existing services or capabilities as an organization, regardless of interruptions. Every time a business or a hospital or, a clinic continues their operations despite a power outage, you're practicing business continuity. The difference between that and emergency management is essentially emergency management tends to be the things we do additional during disasters because the disaster happens, while business continuity focuses on maintaining our existing business operations through the event. So just kind of familiarity with some of these and understand that they overlap and interact with each other quite a bit. All right. So we oriented to emergency management. We learned a little bit about the history. You got some perspectives on how different countries characterize this. Let's break it down a little bit more. So understanding this really requires you to understand the functions and phases. So off to the left, you have a super fancy graph. I'll tell you, if you get 10 emergency managers in a room, they'll probably characterize this 10 different ways. I like to keep it as simple as possible. You'll see something a little bit different from FEMA. I'll talk about that in a minute. But here's the idea. Before an event happens, we're doing two things. We're getting prepared or ready for the event. So if it occurs, we're ready to do what we need to do. And we're also mitigating those hazards, right? So regardless of what happens after the event, we want to make sure when it hits us, it doesn't hit us as hard, right? So that could be everything from reducing the amount of fuel from wildland fire interface to make sure our buildings don't burn, or clearing a little bit of defensible area. That could be something as simple as vaccines, right? Vaccines are a very powerful mitigation tool. We'll talk a little bit about that more in just a minute, but these are the things that we do prior to the disaster. Then the disaster happens, we respond to it. We respond with evacuations, with sheltering, isolation and quarantine, testing, depends on the hazard, depends on the incident, but we respond to it. Then at some point, we try and get back to recovery. We try and get back to a new normal. And that's the recovery, back into preparedness and mitigation, ideally some lessons learned. Now, one of the things almost all emergency managers will agree on, this is not super clean, right? There's not like this magical period where, now we're in recovery. And I think probably the best example would be COVID, right? So when did COVID end, right? At some point we stopped worrying about it as much. At some point we kind of went from the response to the recovery phase, but there's not like a clear marker. It's also not a clear marker for a lot of communities. And now you can tie this to disaster declarations, all that sort of fun stuff. But the reality is these are much more muddled. You're doing preparedness and mitigation during the response and recovery. Your recovery blends into your next preparedness cycle and all those. Now, I will note off to the right, within the United States, we do have a framework for each of these mission areas that guides kind of our nation on how we respond to these things. Prevention and protection are one of the mission areas for FEMA. That kind of relates back to that counterterrorism integration I mentioned previously. These come from DHS, and these are really focused on law enforcement and counterterrorism. But just think of them as preparedness and mitigation as well. We also have a national mitigation framework, a national response framework, and a national disaster recovery framework. Now, these are at a national level, guiding how we respond as a nation, but then the philosophy and the frameworks filter down to a local level as well. So let's go into each of these individual functions. And once again, I'm watching chat. Don't hesitate to raise your hand and ask a question. Otherwise, I'll just keep blabbing. I'm passionate about this stuff. So once I get going, you can't stop me. Mitigation is really anything that prevents or reduces impacts. Okay. So I gave some examples here, but anything that's reducing the impact before the disaster happens, or, actions you take before the disaster happens to reduce the impact, that's mitigation. So that's everything from like infrastructure. Are we retrofitted in our buildings and bridges? Are we installing levees, right? Have we increased if you really kind of want to get into it, it's quite frightening. You look at the stats of dams across the country and how many are privately owned, right? And the vulnerability around that. So a lot of good infrastructure mitigation work would be shoring up those dams. Environment, a lot of times with the environment, it's about the things we don't do. So protecting wildland and wetlands can often help reduce hurricane impacts and storm surge. Clearing brush and debris around wildland, risk areas and facilities, that sort of stuff. Financial, very often this comes down to insurance. Insurance is often a very, very strong mitigation tool, helps kind of spread out those impacts. You can often tie mitigation incentives to insurance premiums. So, hey, if you reduce the hazard in an area, we'll charge you less for your insurance. Really effective mitigation tool. Then resilience building, and that can look at everything from systems to structures to people. Increasing the mental health resilience within a community, the social, financial resilience, whatever that looks like. And, pediatrics is kind of sprinkled throughout all these. I think in some ways infrastructure is a little bit rough to characterize or to think about, but one example I have living out here in the Pacific Northwest is we have Portland on one side of a bridge and a river, and then we have Vancouver, Washington on the other side. And there's a lot of people that cross the bridge. So their family and their kids, might go to school on one side of the bridge and then they travel the other. Well, if you have large populations of parents separated from the children, you have an earthquake or something else happen to that bridge. Now you have a whole bunch of unaccompanied minors, a whole, river away that's now not you can't get across it. So with that in mind, even just things like making sure that populations can reach each other can help pediatric preparedness and mitigation. Certainly with resilience building, looking at increasing the physical and mental health resilience of communities and kids is really important, and there's a lot of work around that. But in general, if we're trying to reduce the impact, we're talking about mitigation. Preparedness, meanwhile, is just about being ready. It's about increasing our readiness. This is kind of the rough cycle to walk it through. This is what we as emergency managers do. It's probably similar to a lot of implementation cycles you've seen before. We develop a mission, scope, and goals. So what is our role in a disaster? What's our piece of the pie? What are the specific things we're trying to do? We inform those with risk, right? So we try and identify risk in the area. What are our specific hazards? What are our vulnerabilities? What do we need to worry about? So for example, believe it or not, up here in Washington, I don't worry about hurricanes much, but I do worry about earthquakes as an example. So what are the local relevant hazards? How vulnerable are we to them? Based on that, what do we need to be able to do in terms of capabilities and capacities, right? So we have our mission, goals, and scope in the context of our hazards and our risk. So what do we need to be able to achieve? We develop plans to achieve those specific things. They typically follow this sort of format of objectives, roles, strategies, resources, and agreements. So what are we trying to achieve? What are the different agencies going to do? What are different teams within the organizations going to do? What are the specific strategies? So, there's a fire, we're going to put wet stuff on the red stuff. That's one of our strategies. What are the resources we need to do it? And what agreements do we need to have to achieve these objectives? Then us as emergency managers, we're skeptical. Just because we don't write it down doesn't mean we believe it'll happen. We want to make sure, just because the plan is on the shelf doesn't mean people know it. So we train people to the plan. We exercise the plan to test the plan, right? So we train people in it. We run them through kind of a progressive exercise series, everything through just like, hey, we're going to talk through how this would go to like, we're actually going to simulate people bleeding out, or we're going to simulate, terrorists, and we're going to simulate all these elements that you have to actively respond to really test your capabilities and test the plan. And then either based on those exercises or a real incident, we go through this process called an after action review. We generate improvement plans, and that informs the future development mission goals, and we move back through the cycle. Within a hospital, this may focus on achieving a certain level of readiness all the way up to being able to deal with a pediatric mass casualty incident, say, for example, a really terrible school bus accident or something occurring at a school. Within a primary care office, this might be focused on ensuring the ability to continue care despite disruptions, such as cyber attacks, power outages, or maybe even playing an expanded role in a disaster in your community. And for EMS, particularly EMSC, this might be kind of regional planning to address a lack of pediatric transport capabilities in certain communities or with a large incident. And it really just depends. A lot of this is kind of focused around a specific issue or hazard or organization. I will say pediatrics is very often not a focus, largely because in my eyes, this is Trevor's opinion, emergency management baseline competency isn't super high. This stuff is hard to achieve. It takes some time. You have to build a program. And it's hard to respond specifically to pediatrics if it's hard for you even to stand up a team and alert and do your baseline functions. So as we see more capability and capacity develop in organizations and our systems over time, I think we'll see more and more focus on groups like pediatrics. Now, I want to note there's some groups that are way far ahead on this and have done a lot of awesome work, and certainly organizations and states as well. This is kind of broad comments, right? I will say very, very few of the plans I've reviewed, and I've done so in a professional capacity, both for organizations and jurisdictions, really have the needed considerations and kind of resources to support pediatrics. Very often they're kind of like a bullet point that's like, hey, as we implement these things, we'll consider kids. But then some organizations do a lot of cool things. They, make sure they have agreements around pediatric technical specialists. So tech spec is a term in an incident command system. I'll get to that in a minute, where they take someone's pediatric expertise and they make them available. So as disaster response teams are responding, they can call someone up that has that subject matter expertise. So It really just depends. Ideally, this is in that whole cycle, everything from how we identify risks and capabilities and hazards all the way through. And different organizations and communities do better or worse on this for pediatrics. All right. Response. We talked about mitigation. We talked about preparedness. Now we're talking about response. It's really governed by concepts, structures, and processes. It's highly adaptable to each community. Plans look really specific depending on the community, but there's some broad things. We have the National Incident Management System that was mentioned before previously. This guides how we respond across the country. It talks about how we do resource management, how we do mutual aid, so how different organizations, communities help one another, how we communicate, how we manage information, how we do reporting. And then the big thing there is command and coordination. That's a lot of what emergency management does during an incident. When you see these big groups called incident management teams, or you might have seen the shots during COVID of a whole bunch of people, in this area, you've got screens all over, they're coordinating. That's really the command and coordination element. These frameworks do define federal, tribal, state, and local emergency management responsibilities. I will note, and I'll note this probably a couple times, tribes are really unique as sovereign nations. They can choose whether or not they want to work directly, with the local city, local county, the state, or they can bypass all those and go directly and work directly with the federal government. I've had tribes, do a lot of partnership on a local level and mutual aid with the local county. And I've also had groups bypass us as a state and decide, no, I want to work directly with the feds. So they have a lot of latitude in that. And emergency management looks radically different from tribe to tribe. Command and coordination. So what fits in kind of that? You have these sets of management characteristics, and you could Google this phrase. It pulls up like a box. I think it's a 16 or so. And these are various characteristics or features that we have to have in our response. So regardless of how we're responding, we consider these essential. And there are things like unity of effort. So are we all working towards a common goal? Another one is, everybody only has one direct supervisor. So there's a chain of command element. So you're only getting one set of directions. Helps with authority, helps with accountability. And there's kind of a set of characteristics that we note. There's also this thing called incident command system. I'll briefly talk about that. You might have heard it described as hospital incident command system. They're practically the same thing, slightly adjusted because, people like to make it specific to their environment. That guides how we actually respond to disasters in terms of a process. People get certified in this. There's training around that. It's one of the things I teach. It's a really cool system. You can do it to plan everything from a birthday party to, like a national response to the public health and medical components of a, pandemic. So it's a really cool system, highly adaptable. They're supported by these groups called emergency operations centers. We'll talk about them, and multi-agency coordination groups, which are essentially where we get all the policymakers and politicians together to make resource and priority decisions. We'll also talk a little bit about the private sector governance. It's largely tied to federal funding and regulation like CMS, and then the private sector has a whole wide range of capabilities. So, incident command system. What is this? All right, don't worry. I won't drown you in stuff, but it's important you're a little bit oriented to it. I'm going to give you some nitty-gritty details. The big pieces are incident command system and IMTs. Incident management teams are the groups that run this system. It's HICS, Hospital Incident Command System, is basically it implemented in healthcare. And really, it's a management system for incident response. Almost every disaster across the United States is managed by this sort of process. It was developed out of California wildfire and kind of refined, made general all hazards. It provides a flexible yet standardized approach to incident response. It includes everything from like what are the positions, how are they organized, what are the processes and forms. And it's why we're able to take like a wildland firefighter out of California, partner them with a cop from Texas, and have them respond to, like a terrorist incident in New York. It gives us the same set of terminology, allows us to ideally seamlessly plug together. Now, how much is the uptake kind of depends from location to location, but that's the idea, right? It's why we're able to kind of blend resources across systems, across jurisdictions during a disaster and work together effectively. Major outcome of some of those prior disasters I showed you on the timeline was the development of a system like this. It's used in any sort of incident that might exceed our capability or day-to-day systems. So once the day-to-day systems are no longer adequate or they might become inadequate, we shift over to this. And it's also used a lot of times to prepare for incidents like college sports or VIP visits. It lets them get exercise and practice in using the system so they're not entirely new to it. When disaster hits, it builds relationships between organizations. Then also, should you have something happen during one of those, parades or college sports, you can flip right over your disaster response system and plan. So why do we use it? I mentioned some of this before. It allows us to command and coordinate across agencies and systems. It's how you're able to take a group like the Department of Corrections, the Department of Health, and shove them together in an incident response system and have them work outside of like their day-to-day organizational structures. It's really cool to be able to do stuff like that. It's pre-designed to be flexible and modular. You only turn on what you want. It's highly adaptable, has a chain of command and legal responsibility, and it really represents a best practice refined by practitioners in disaster response over time. Not everyone uses it, but almost everybody does. And I've done it, use it everything from like a home fire preparedness campaign, to mobilizing strike teams to novel pathogen events and radiation. So it's a really robust system. Supporting these teams on the ground, the incident management teams running that process. So like the actual fire camp responding to the wildfire, behind them, often on a county level or a state level, are emergency operations centers. What these groups do, and this, image off the left might have captured some of what you've seen on TV or, some of your perception of it. These groups support the on-scene incident response. Now, I want to be really clear. It's support. They are not in their chain of command, right? The on-scene incident response runs it, but they provide that coordination support behind them, right? So, hey, we've got offers for donations. You need, food support. We need a specific, truck or some sort of equipment from a neighboring county. We'll handle all that for you. You just let us know what you need. They're typically organized, like I mentioned, agency, jurisdiction, or interagency levels. There's a whole bunch of different ways to structure them. Most of them are organized around emergency support functions. We'll describe what those are in just a couple of minutes. And they do a whole bunch of things in that last bullet point: resources, technical assistance, connection to other responses, and so forth. The herding of the elected officials, right? Keeping them away from the on-scene incident. I will say children, or the focus of the children, is very often not present in these emergency operations centers, and that's not neglect. Disasters bring an unreal level of overwhelm. A focus on specific population often requires a high level of baseline adequacy and then some sort of like expertise you can bring in. Like I mentioned before, one of the best practices is taking someone with a lot of pediatric expertise in a specific area and getting them trained in a little bit of the incident command system so they're at least familiar with it, and having them deployed as a technical specialist, right? So we have these terms called tech specs, and they're essentially subject matter experts on a specific hazard or maybe a population or a function that can come in and advise both the incident management team and these operations centers to be like, hey, your plan around decontamination is great, but maybe you don't want to separate kids and parents after they were just traumatized, and now you're going to put them through a decontamination process, those sorts of things. So very often it relies on an integration of outside experts into these models to be able to provide some of that. All right. Hopefully your heads aren't spinning too quick. I'm looking for questions as we go. Don't hesitate to stop me, ask questions. If not, I'll keep rolling. So recovery, I like to mention it's about getting back to a normal. The unfortunate thing, and this is one of those things I almost hear every disaster. I almost always hear something along the lines of, I didn't think it would happen to me. It didn't think it would happen to us. This happens to other people. Very common reaction. Almost everyone thinks disasters happen to other people, right? And then the other kind of thing that I almost always tend to hear is, I want to get back to normal, right? And the unfortunate reality is, for the overwhelming majority of disasters, you don't get back to normal. You get back to a new normal. And I think that's partially what we're seeing in COVID. So recovery almost starts at, the second the incident begins. Short-term recovery can look things like, okay, people lost their homes to a wildfire. Can we get them back into a hotel for now? Right? Can we get them access to some services? Can we get them clothes and food? Longer term recovery will be a little bit more focused on rebuilding infrastructure, long-term processes. Very often you see groups like long-term recovery organizations stood up, and that's moving towards a new normal. It happens across all different functions and industries, everything from the infrastructure, the economy, healthcare, people's mental health. Once again, I'll note children are often not a major focus during recovery, although once you actually get into it, people realize it's critically important. Here's the sticking point for a lot of recovery efforts, and this is kind of like a major indicator. If you don't have childcare back and you don't have schools back, recovery is not moving forward because people can't go to work. So very, very essentially, that kind of hits people during the recovery process of like, oh yeah, we really do need to focus on kids, and here's kind of the impacts. So. All right, last little bit, and then we'll end with some questions. I'm going to run you through kind of how this is structured. I'll give you a few examples and really kind of unpack this. And then hopefully we'll have some time for some question and answer if folks have any at the end. So behind, all these concepts and these principles, there's some planning frameworks, right? I mentioned a couple of them. Response, it's guided by the National Incident Management System, National Response Framework. It organizes our response into these things called ESFs, emergency support functions. These are often replicated one-to-one at state and local level, although not always. And if you think about it, when a disaster hits, there's a whole bunch of things we need to do, right? Earthquake happens. It's like, okay, we got to do damage assessment. We got to restore power. Well, to restore power, we need to get the roads open. We got to get people to shelters. We got to feed them. We got to do casework. What about the medical? Yada, yada, right? So it keeps going on. And there's a whole bunch of agencies involved in that. So what ESFs do, emergency support functions, is we kind of slice up the different functions we need to do in a disaster. And that allows us to, one, plan as a group, right? So it's like all the transportation people, Department of Transportation, the various supporting agencies. We can plan around how we're going to do that. And then we can flip it on and off during a disaster. Most plans are structured this way, although not always. There's a lot of benefit to it. And then on the recovery side, it's guided by a disaster recovery framework. And where there's emergency support functions, on the recovery side, there's recovery support functions. Same idea. How do we slice it up? How do we organize groups around this? Very quickly, this is what it looks like as an example in Washington. If you wanted to, you could punch in your state, you would punch in emergency support function, like let's say 1, transportation, and you'll probably get the plan. Heck, you can probably find these for your local county very often if you want to see how these are organized. But these are the various slices. I listed the specific groups in charge. I'll just highlight a couple as we go through for the sake of time. A lot show up certainly for pediatrics and ESF6, mass care. That's the bulk sheltering, feeding, distribution of goods. A lot of states that's ran by DSHS. Red Cross plays a role, voluntary organizations play a role, but certainly how do you provide care to kids post-disaster? Sometimes bigger focus or less of a focus depending on the state. Obviously, ESF8, that's the group we all play in, believe it or not. That's public health, medical, emergency medical services, and mental health, often led by the Department of Health. But as you can imagine, there's a whole bunch of organizations that play a role in that. So what happens is you have these kind of interagency plans set up at state and local levels. Then specific agencies have a role in it, like Department of Health or this healthcare facility or this healthcare coalition. And then they create agency level plans to support the interagency objectives. And essentially, you see pediatrics show up sometimes in those. Sometimes they're better represented at the agency level plans, and sometimes there's pieces of those showing up in each of these ESFs as well. These go on, you see about 15 or 16 of them. Hazmat, certainly a lot of pediatric considerations there, not just in terms of impacts, but decontamination, the approach to that, public safety, long-term recovery, and external affairs as the public communication. Same thing, recovery support functions. These aren't one-to-one. They're pared down a little bit more, but they're kind of packaged around different functions. So housing, culture and historical resources, natural resources. These are kind of, they use this lifeline sort of model almost of looking at what different things do we need to have established for a community to recover. Obviously, lots of pediatric considerations in health services, social services, and almost all these, housing and so forth. Ideally, what happens is, different response groups get stood up. So you might bring in someone from like Department of Education or maybe a community group that represents children or an advocacy group, and they're integrated into the planning and response pieces to make sure pediatric needs are met. That happens often at a state level, ideally happens at a local level, if there's any local plans. And then where the rubber hits the road is, within agencies implementing their own plans, they ideally engage experts as well. Private sector certainly plays a really big role. Private companies, business continuity is really their primary duty. So making sure like, hey, it's kind of important that you're able to deliver healthcare despite, cyber attacks and power outages and all those pieces. So that's often their primary role, but sometimes they have broader roles during the response, right? They do more than business continuity. They do emergency response and management. A lot of them have response teams. I'll tell you, some of these big companies, it's wild. Disney, Waffle House, Walmart have huge teams dedicated to monitoring disasters and responding to them. Really, really impressive stuff. Huge emergency operations centers, deployable teams. And then some of these agencies have pre-designed response roles. Here's what we're going to do when a disaster happens. Here's what our healthcare coalition is going to do. Here's what our hospital facility is going to do, our individual clinic. Obviously, a lot of work around charity. You don't need permission to help, but ideally you plug into these structures to provide assistance. Then I always like to note predatory elements as well. Typically happens during rebuilding. A lot of contractors come in the area, may not be certified, might not do the work right, might take your money and leave. So there's some work around protecting consumers and organizations during recovery. Unfortunately, it's needed. Then non-governmental and faith-based, you have formalized elements. A lot of those ESFs and RSFs, the emergency support functions, recovery support functions, have nonprofit roles in them. I would wager there's probably rarely a state that doesn't have at least some nonprofit integrated in at least a couple of their emergency support functions. They play a lot of critical roles, everything from interagency coordination, feeding, casework, cleanup, childcare. There's whole nonprofits dedicated to just childcare post-disaster because it's a huge need. And then sometimes there's ad hoc ones that get stood up. Occupy Sandy, it's a really interesting case study on kind of a spontaneously organized group in response to Sandy. They mobilized 3 times as many volunteers as all the official response organizations combined. Cool case study there. And then there's this thing called disaster convergence. It's almost like an immune system reaction. When a disaster happens, resources, people, staff, stuff just kind of flood into an area for a period of time, which is really interesting. The thing I always like to tell people is almost everyone thinks they don't have a disaster role till it hits, and then you're in. If you provide a service to the community, if you provide assistance, if you have a role within the community, you're doing something during that disaster, whether you like it or not, because you're part of it, right? Disasters, unfortunately, don't always give you the opportunity to opt in or not. To kind of recap, non-governmental organizations, there's specific agencies, faith-based or not. Some of them have formalized roles, some of them don't. Within your community, and certainly within your state, there's these groups called community or voluntary organizations acting in disasters. This is how the different nonprofits plan ahead of time. It's one of the big lessons learned out of some large hurricane responses. They found multiple nonprofits were responding to the same communities and duplicating efforts, and some were being missed. And then there's like no integrated casework. So this concepts of these groups of nonprofits coming together to plan on how they'll respond and collaborate with government, COADs and VOADs were established. I've helped chair a couple of these. They're awesome organizations. Also a good place where you can kind of volunteer and plug in as well. Now, there's the government coordination, the nonprofit coordination, both valid and important parts. And it's certainly an area where a little bit of additional pediatric expertise can help. And then post-disaster times, you'll see long-term recovery organizations stood up. These happen very, very frequently with wildfires, and that's kind of managing the ongoing recovery, the casework, the rebuild, and donations for a specific community. And like I said, nonprofits play a lot of role, and sometimes they're less visible. You can go to, once again, the National VOAD website to kind of find a little bit more about these. Or like I said, I know there's a state VOAD in almost every state. I'd probably say every state. And then often there's more localized ones in communities or counties as well. So I'm going to go through this pretty quickly. Just noting some of the folks in chat as well. You'll fall into a few different places of this. And I'll apologize. I'm looking at some of the acronyms. I might need help with your acronyms. I recognize PMHCA, but the paths and the DCPAP, not as familiar with. But somewhere within this, right, you fall into an emergency management matrix. Either you're in private sector and you're trying to continue your functions during a disaster, or maybe you're part of a broader healthcare organization, which at some level, I'd bet is part of an emergency management team or has an emergency manager that's connected to other structures, right? If not, certainly the government is a place where these plug in. Everything from the local emergency response roles with EMS, police and fire, all the way up to how do we coordinate on scene with incident management, or the broad coordination roles, like I talked about, where a lot of pediatrics rests within these ESFs and RSFs as well. Then obviously the non-governmental and faith-based, and then kind of group I haven't talked about, there's entities stood up just for the purpose of preparedness and response. Pediatric Pandemic Network is an example of this, right? The Pediatric Disaster Centers of Excellence across the country are examples of this. They're often kind of coalitions of the different responders, subject matter experts, and emergency managers. And we're groups that kind of get together and provide that assistance. So I will say, based on the acronyms, it's kind of hard to figure out where everybody might fit exactly. The private sector, I would say, obviously a clear tie-in. Now, are you going to be the person that's like, okay, I'm going to go down to the emergency operations center and roll up and let them know, what's going to go on and how we're going to do these elements with pediatrics or the specific consideration? No, right? But that's where, one, within your system, with your own organization, is there an emergency manager? If so, somewhere up the chain, they're connected to those pieces. So how does your program connect? How can you lend expertise? And then also within that, right, very often these different organizations are part of coalitions. For example, healthcare coalitions, where it might be, hey, we've got, and this happens quite a bit in Washington State. We have a pretty strong healthcare coalition, the Northwest Healthcare Response Network, and they've done a lot of great work to where the different organizations can kind of provide mutual aid to one another, where it's like, hey, we got this expertise, we can loan it out to you. I know their PMHCA program is a really great example of that, and the lines they've established, and certainly the Team B program they just stood up. And then aside from that, it can even be things like just sharing situational awareness, what we're hearing, what are we running out of? What are we seeing in our community? So one of the things I'd encourage you to do is, if you're interested in some of these pieces, is one, is there an element of emergency management in our organization? How do I plug into that? How can I play a role? And then also, does our organization play, any broader role? Is it connected to any of these coalitions or these planning efforts? And how is pediatrics, integrated? Is there an area where I can lend some of my expertise? Very often, what makes the difference, we like to talk about plans and procedures, but one, it's like, do you know someone? Can you trust them? Do you have their card before the disaster hits? And do you have that expert to call on? So very often, even just shaking hands, letting people know you're available and making sure, they have your name and number and the expertise you're willing to provide can go a long way, pre-disaster. And that's really the start of all this, right? Is building those connections and that need. So when the disaster hits, we can provide some assistance. So I'm going to keep moving just to wrap up. So we have about 10 minutes if folks have any questions. Kind of the final note on all this is, as the complexity or as the needs for the incident increase, so the more difficult it is, the more the incident demands, we need to bring in more resources. So if you look at the bottom part, you have a small car accident, you don't need a ton of stuff, right? And the supporting organizational structure behind it, the coordination behind it, there doesn't have to be a lot because the day-to-day systems support that. But as the needs increase, as the complexity of the incident increases, those resource needs increase, and there's a whole bunch of structure needed to bring in behind it. So, if you think about some of the different agencies on these calls, you put them into one community to get everyone to work together and provide assistance, certainly to a disaster, there's a whole bunch of communication and coordination that needs to happen behind the scenes. And then to kind of wrap up, the more needs we have, the more partners we need to bring to the table, the more problems we have from a coordination and management perspective. So one of the things you'll hear as you get into this work, it's captured there at the bottom. If you haven't heard this before, let me be the first one to share it with you. All disasters start and end locally and stop, right? So what that means is even though a disaster happens, resources might come in from the local community, they might come in from the state or neighboring states or federal or even international for some of these, right? At the end of the day, the disaster started with just the local community, and at some point those resources are going to go away and it's going to end locally. And part of the reason we share this is it's a little bit of a mantra for us when we deploy into a local community, is to recognize not only, do they know their community, but ultimately they're the ones that are going to have to deal with these problems, and they're the ones that really, need to drive the decision. So when we deploy in to provide assistance, we try not to come in with like, this is how you do it sort of attitude, but rather, to understand their needs and provide that assistance, recognizing that, they started with this and they're going to be the ones dealing with this when we go back home. So that's the local response, right? It happens locally. There's often some organic response. There might be some local coordination and mutual aid. As there's more needs, we start to bring in resources from state agencies, different state response assets, maybe even coordinating between different tribes or counties and tribes. I've seen that in Washington State where there's mutual aid between the county and the tribe, or the tribe and the state, which is great. Recognizing once again that the tribes as sovereign nations can choose to work with any level of government they see fit within emergency management. Then, if we can't provide enough resources there, then we look at state to state. So there's this program called EMAC, the Emergency Management Assistance Compact. That's essentially how we share resources between states with mutual aid. What are other regional resources out there? Regional teams are stockpiles, like the Strategic National Stockpile, resource of various medical goods for rapid deployments distributed across the country. And then, federal resources, almost everyone thinks this is where you start. It's not. Disaster happens, you don't bring in the National Guard. Every time I teach people incident command system, we're running through our first scenario, they're always like, we'll activate the National Guard. No, you won't. You'll burn through all these things before you activate them. And even then, they are pricey, right? So often you have to manage disasters with a price tag. But, when big ones happen, you bring in federal resources that could be deployable teams like medical assistance teams or mortuary teams, subject matter experts, data. Then obviously the feds carry the cash. So with that in mind, there's a whole bunch of series and structures behind these different elements to support their response. You can kind of see how these pieces, right, would start to lead in this sort of big org chart behind the scene. And, within that, believe it or not, you guys are all part of this. So you might not be reflected as a little, box there, but, you're connected to one of those boxes and connected to a box somewhere down the chain. So with that in mind, you've been hearing me rant for about 50 minutes. I think that's it for me today. I'm glad to answer any questions or hear any comments. Thanks for spending some time with me. And with that, I will just share these next dates and turn it back over to the PMHCA team.
Trevor, this is Anna. Thank you so much. This is an enlightening information. We're gonna open it up for questions for everyone, as well as an evaluation. It should have popped up on your screen. Please complete. It's very important for us to know your to know the information you learn and you would like to learn in the future. Sorry, I had to think there for a second. On the screen here, you also will see the upcoming events from the EIC. Please remember to visit our website to register for those. And then with that, I do have a question for Trevor. From the perspective of different organizations and community mental health needs during a disaster, would you say the need is greater at the time where disaster just, like I'm looking like a larger scale disaster just occurred, or days after?
Yeah, great question. And let me say, here's how I've conceptualized it. And I think this is kind of the right way to think about it. Mental health impacts are a quiet tsunami. So what happens is, disaster happens, you often get a swell of support. Most of the mental health needs do not present themselves in the first 30 or 60 days, right? What tends to happen in general, now recognizing there's exceptions to all this, is about 4 to 6 months out or so, you start to see a whole bunch of impacts show up in the community, right? You start to see it in your emergency departments, people start going to school counselors, they start requesting private assistance, you start seeing calls to helplines. And that's just kind of the normal trajectory of how these things show up over time. Now, for a short period of time, you'll see what's called this acute distress syndrome, right? Or disorder. And essentially, it's a very normative reaction to disasters. Like disasters are not normal, right? They're pretty wild. Some stuff happens to you that you'd prefer not to have happen. And believe it or not, it's completely normal to be a little distressed during that. It's very common. 50% of the population will have some form of that. That's normal. That goes away over time. It's important not to pathologize it, right? And one of the big things we can do is kind of help educate people like, hey, it's kind of normal. Your kid might regress a couple age levels, right? And it's normal. You might have anxiety and trouble sleeping. You're not crazy, right? That's a normative reaction. But what you do tend to see is around that 4 to 6 month period, those needs tend to spike. And that's kind of the challenge because that's after a whole bunch of the disaster response pulls back. And that's one of the reasons mental health needs are often neglected post-disaster is, the media's gone away, the funding's gone away, the broad disaster response communities pulled back. And now the community is kind of dealing with this challenge of disillusionment in their new normal, right? So it's one of those things where it comes as a surge, but it comes delayed, 3, 4, 6 months out.
Thank you.
If you don't mind, I might pull this down. There we go.
Are there other questions, suggestions?
I'll just assume everyone's heads are spinning.
They're overwhelmed with information. There you go.
It's a lot of stuff, and I talk like I'm from the
There
East
is.
Coast, so
Oh, we got a great information. Here you go.
No, that was great. And I think for those around the call too, as you're maybe still trying to wrap your heads around, kind of where do I fit in all of this disaster preparedness talk? Mental health is a huge component. Trevor has firsthand experience of what happens when, communities, I don't want to say neglect, but obviously again, they're tackling, kind of the present danger, buildings are falling down, there's fires burning. Those are important to address, but mental and behavioral health kind of goes by the wayside in the heat of the moment. And so then months down the road, realizing, oh no, we didn't do our part to necessarily plan for the mental and behavioral health ramifications that are affecting our population. So kind of wrap your head around that as you're thinking, what's my role in this disaster? Mental health is a huge component of it.
And to Jen's point, sounds like it's never too late to address. So if you are having the mental health resources, pediatric mental health resources specifically, reach out to the team that is managing the emergency situation, even months after, to see what assistance could be provided. Trevor, anything to add to this?
No, I think advocate and connect, right? Like that's kind of it. As I've noted, right, and I'm trying not to throw folks under the bus, like disaster response is hard. Getting these things ready is hard. Like you think about how difficult it is for these systems to work together day to day. We got to get them to work together in a disaster in organizational environments they're not used to, right? So I don't want to throw people under the bus, but being able to understand where you could connect and advocate, as you both noted, I think is really important, because sometimes all it takes is someone coming in and be like, hey, have you thought about the kids? Did you think about these specific pieces? And by the way, I'm glad to kind of like serve as someone or connect you to someone, right? Or to a team or association. But yeah, I think the big thing I'd say is don't wait till the disaster hits to exchange business cards, right? Even if it's just like hey, I was just curious about this and we're glad to plug in. Or when it hits, don't hesitate to reach out. My one thing would be is don't self-deploy to the scene. So that's the one big thing is, don't just show up to the disaster site and say, hey, I'm here to help. Because that's sure a challenge, but yeah.
Well, thank you, Trevor. I'm not seeing any more questions. I'm checking the chat, and we got a great info. So with that, I think we are ready to hit the pause and our